Innovation, the opportunity to improve upon an idea, thought, or piece of technology to allow for the betterment of mankind. In a world filled with the possibility of innovation, we must take advantage of every opportunity to improve upon the future of mankind. But only one team today is allowing for the future of our world, and that team, ladies and gentlemen, is Team Proposition. Throughout this debate, we will prove to you how there is no future without nuclear energy, and that any refusal to accept this claim is a hindrance upon future energy advancements and a denial of the blatant truth. Now, we will prove this to you through the following 2 points. First, we will look at the benefits of nuclear energy, and secondly, we will talk about how nuclear energy is crucial to energy development. Now, I will go into our first 2 points, and my second speaker will re-enter the first 2 points and then further extend these arguments. Today, Team Proposition must prove that there is a place for nuclear energy in the future, while Team Opposition must prove why the future cannot exist with nuclear energy. And through evidence and rational reasoning, they will simply not be able to do this. Up and down the bench today, Team Proposition will stand by the line that advancements of nuclear energy allow for innovation. And I would like to begin by discussing the benefits of this form. There are many benefits of nuclear energy that cannot be provided by other forms of energy. Nuclear energy is the most sustainable form of energy. Other forms of energy are running out because there are only finite amounts of this energy within our planet Earth. And unless Team Opposition is willing to concede to the fact that we're going to run out of atoms, no thank you, then we will see that nuclear energy is not going to run out in the future, and that is just one of the things that makes this form of energy so unique. We see that their environmental resources are not needed. Wind is not needed. We do not need water energy. We simply need atoms and the technology to build upon this, which the world has, and nuclear energy is able to be sustained through this. And also, in nuclear energy, the return is greater than many other forms of energy. So to say, countries are able to get more bang for their buck if they invest in nuclear energy because it has greater rewards than other forms of energy. Would you not agree?
Would countries get bang for their buck if their citizens are dying because of nuclear radiation?
Nuclear radiation is simply not a problem because when we see countries such as France who are currently developing ways to clean up nuclear radiation, and we are seeing that the global world is able to deal with this problem. So nuclear radiation is an argument that is simply not the case because we already have countries working on this and we haven't seen large-scale problems from this. So with that, we will move into how one of the other benefits is that it is much more efficient. It can be used in nations that don't have the resources to provide for other forms of energy. It can be used in nations that do not have the ability to use large bodies of water for water energy as forms of alternative energy, or wind, or oil deposits. When we see that if we take away nuclear energy from the global energy system, we are not allowing these countries to improve upon their energy sources. It is not fair to say that a country cannot use nuclear energy because it doesn't have any other resources, and that is causing their citizens to stay cold at night, to get pneumonia from not having enough heat from nuclear energy. When we see that nuclear energy is a way for these countries that would not otherwise have resources to gain energy sources, we must allow for this to continue, as it will allow for future advancements as well. Similarly, with a more efficient energy resource, we are allowing the world to accept this. Nuclear energy is already a worldwide accepted form of energy because the world understands the fact and is continuing to understand the many benefits that nuclear energy provides. It is not as prominent, other forms of energy are not as prominent in energy because they don't pave the way for the future. Nuclear energy will be able to pave the way for the future. And if we do not allow for nuclear energy, we are diverting attention away by splitting the resources that if a country can or cannot do this. And this is a hindrance to energy development as a whole in any form of energy. Now, let's talk about our second point, which is how nuclear energy is crucial to innovation. Nuclear energy allows for scientific involvement, and it provides a stepping stone to an even better forms of energy. You simply cannot exclude one form of energy and expect to develop future forms of energy by cutting out specific forms of energy. When we take away energy and take away different forms of energy, we are not allowing for development, and we are not allowing for progress. And these are two things that are crucial to the betterment of our future, which is what team proposition stands for and what team opposition is not allowing to happen. We see examples such as coal allowing for steam. We see examples of oil allowing for biofuels. We see how forms of energy in the present, or in this case talking about in the past, allowed for even better forms of energy in the future. And this is what will be happening when we do in fact use nuclear energy. We are providing for the future. We cannot expect that we will be able to provide future and more efficient forms of energy if we are cutting out forms of energy because we are scared of radiation, which is already being dealt with, and other things of that nature. It is simply illogical, and it cannot happen.
On that point, ma'am.
Yes.
I would like to point out that this debate is about current nuclear energy as it stands and not some fancy that side proposition imagines will happen to nuclear energy maybe centuries into the future.
Team opposition makes this statement, but nuclear energy as a whole is currently very beneficial. It is very accepted on the worldwide community. So if we are talking about it on the present, then we are doing a great job. Nuclear energy is providing for these nations. Nuclear energy is allowing for advancements. So in the present, it's doing its job. And as we saw through examples and through this reasoning, it will do its job in the future. So they simply have no point or no ground on this statement. Technology gets better over time. We see this as a simple fact, and we have seen this in examples throughout our past, present, and with the continuation of nuclear energy in the future. Excluding markets from nuclear development will not allow them to grow. And this is the main point, and this is extremely crucial to this debate. We will not have any advancements by cutting out this form of energy. Excluding nuclear energy from the portfolio is excluding any possibility for future benefits that this has to offer. We saw that in the past, we developed oil, and we talked about oil. And then through this oil development, we have biofuels. The same thing will happen with this nuclear energy. The same thing will happen by investing in this form of energy. This form of energy that can be provided to all nations. The same thing will happen when we continue to push for nuclear energy because of the great benefits that it has and because the unique quality that it has that other forms of energy simply do not have to offer. We have never seen a form of energy like nuclear energy. We have never had the benefits through any other form of energy that nuclear energy has to offer. And because of this, we must continue because it will allow for advancements in the future. And there is a future with nuclear energy, and without it, we are cutting off our ties to better advancements and to a positive future of the human race. So we will continue to stand by the line today that through nuclear energy, we will allow for advancements and allow for innovation. And these two key qualities that this energy form has to offer prove why team proposition must win this case. Thank you.
Move my.
Yeah. Thank you.
Good. And I call upon the first ops speaker to open the case for his side.
There is a future without nuclear energy. It's a world where the environment is devastated, where nuclear fallout is widespread, where nuclear rods continue to infect our planet and kill off our people. On side opposition, we believe this is not the future we want to see. This is why we proudly oppose the resolution. This House believes that there is no future without nuclear energy. So, on our burden today, on side opposition, we will prove to you and show that there is not only a future without nuclear energy, but we will even go beyond this. We will actually prove and attempt to prove that there is a better future when it comes to not having nuclear energy. We will prove this in 3 ways. First, we will explain the harms of nuclear energy. Second, that better alternatives exist. And thirdly, the brighter future without nuclear energy that my partner will explain in his speech. Before I go through these points, I'd like to go through a rebuttal. So, side proposition has given us 2 points today. First, the benefits of nuclear energy. They see that it's the most sustainable amount of energy because the returns are greater and it is forever lasting. However, I don't know if side proposition does not realize this, but there's sun out there. There's wind out there.
Sure.
There's water out there. And these types of forms of energy will never cease to exist. And when they do, we're dead anyway, so there's no point of debating this. Secondly, on how the returns are greater, as you get the biggest bang for your buck. Well, when your people have to clean up nuclear waste, when all your people are devastated by the radiation dying, is that really the biggest bang for your buck? Lastly, on how the world accepts nuclear energy. This is completely false, because after the recent devastation of Japan's nuclear reactors, major countries like Germany, have even vowed to end their nuclear programs. On their second point, on how nuclear energy leads to innovation, on how there's no advancement by cutting nuclear energy. On side opposition, we clearly disagree with this. In fact, we argue that right now, by using nuclear energy, we are fostering a dependence on this. And what this means is that we are leaving no room for scientists to go out there and study hydrogen energy, to study and improve wind energy, solar energy, and even discover alternative energy sources that are A, truly renewable, and B, do not have the harmful side effects of nuclear energy. Moving on to side opposition's points. Our first point on how nuclear energy causes harms. We will prove this in 2 ways. First, on how it devastates the environment and the people. This is because nuclear waste is inevitable. We have spent fuel rods because these rods eventually run out and need to be replaced. We also have wastewater that is needed to cool down these nuclear reactors. Well, the fact is there's no effective way to dispose of this waste. Wastewater, it's dumped in oceans. It's put and stored in the ground where it only leaks and devastates the environment. Furthermore, these types of radiation stay in the ground for 10,000 years. These are 30 generations of people who will be harmed and destroyed by the harmful effects of radiation. Well, what are these effects? First, there's cancer, genetic mutation, birth defects, leukemia, any kind of devastating disease we know out there will be caused by nuclear radiation and only cause the death of our people. As I stated before, there's no effective way to dispose of this. This is the scary part. It is only buried in the ground where it leaks and infects groundwater, infects our food supplies, and leads to the death of our people for centuries.
Sir.
Now, yes.
Sir, we argue that, first of all, nuclear energy isn't the only form of energy with significant amount of waste, but second of all, the developments that are already taking place to dispose of nuclear waste
thank you.
lead to development and improvement.
Thank you. Even if we concede that developments are happening, are there any developments today that are preventing disasters like Japan, that are preventing disasters Chernobyl? Even today, in the Chernobyl area, radioactivity still stands after decades of devastation. Once again, this brings us right to our example of Japan, where nuclear reactors blew up after natural disasters and radiation levels skyrocketed. This tainted the food supply, the water supply. It forced people to evict out of their homes. We bring up more examples. Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, these just go on and on, how nuclear energy, when the disasters occur, are unpreventable. This is because the probability of this happening is 100%. There's no way side proposition can guarantee today that they can prevent natural disasters like tsunamis in Japan from happening. Furthermore, when these disasters do happen and nuclear reactors are destroyed, the magnitude is devastating, as I already explained in our first points. So, this is a matter of life and death for hundreds of millions, if not the entire world out there in the future. And that is why these food sources are contaminated, because people die, because water sources are contaminated, and because this waste sits there for 10,000 years. We cannot agree that there is a future with nuclear energy out there, because the harms of nuclear energy clearly outweigh any benefits side proposition has proposed today. Moving on to our second point, on we are developing better alternatives than already exist. Of course, there's clean energy out there. There's energy that relies on the water of our earth. It relies on the sunlight that we all see out here today. It relies on wind. These are truly renewable sources of energy. Nuclear waste, we have to continually dispose of this. We have to continually monitor how our environment is being affected. On the other hand, we have solar energy, which is now increasing in popularity. It's becoming more cheaper, it's becoming more efficient, and there's absolutely no waste involved that devastates the environment. We also see wind power. These are placed in strategic locations that allow humans to harness the power of a wind, an important resource that we cannot let down upon. We have tide power. We have hydrogen energy that is now being developed that allows us to use hydrogen and water to produce clean energy that only emits water vapor, rather different than the nuclear radioactive waste that side proposition is advocating for today. Furthermore, I'd like to explain the point that by relying on nuclear energy, we are actually fostering dependence that stems and depletes and cuts any kind of innovation from the future, which directly clashes with their second point. This is because right now, governments are too focused on nuclear energy. We're trying to pour resources into building new billion-dollar reactors. We're trying to develop these ways to treat waste that is actually impossible to treat. This nuclear radioactivity will always stay in our Earth for the next 10,000 years if we even dare to use it. On the other hand, we could be using this money instead of in nuclear reactors to fund other developments like hydrogen energy that has absolutely no waste and no detriments to the environment. We could be using this to develop solar panels that could be more efficient. Right now, they may not be at the prime time of use, but right now, after we pour money into investment into solar panels, they can be 100% efficient. They can fully harness the energy out there that is up to human disposal that does not devastate our world. So, what does this mean? Renewable energy is truly clean energy, and disregard anything side proposition tells you today on how nuclear energy can be treated. No, it stays in our Earth and it continues to infect our people. With using renewable energy instead of nuclear energy, we're proving that there's a better future out there without nuclear energy. That we value the life of the people when using renewable energy and not just destroying our planet over the death that side proposition is showing you when it comes to radioactivity. So, for the reasons of supporting life on our planet, for more renewable sources of energy that can truly sustain the human race and not lead to the extinction that side proposition will eventually come down to today, I urge a strong vote in favor of the opposition.
I now call upon the second Gov speaker.
There is a serious energy crisis today in our world, and we argue that it is only Team Proposition who is actually creating the only reliable, sustainable, and efficient source of energy which will create long-lasting change, not only in developed countries, but also the developing world. So before I move on to our case, I'll first say that we stand under the team line that advancements of nuclear energy will lead to innovation. And I'm going to address the arguments that the opposition has brought up and then go into our own case. Now, first of all, in response to our argument about the benefits of nuclear energy, they have argued that there are alternatives like sun, wind, water, and solar. But first of all, we see many worse problems in a lot of these forms of alternative energy. For example, in solar energy, research has proven that there are arsenic is created, and those types of problems will still exist, where there are effects of alternative energy which will harm the environment. And we argue that in nuclear energy, we have been finding ways to solve the radiation problem, as we have seen in France, where they're recycling their nuclear waste in order to recreate it into more energy. And we see that we are actually innovating in terms of our nuclear energy in ways that we haven't been in alternative energy. But furthermore, we argue that this is the only type of energy that can be used across the world, regardless of whether you have an ocean next to you, regardless of whether you have a lake, regardless of whether you have wind. Wouldn't you agree?
No, I would disagree, because across the planet, people have wind, people have water, people have sun. Without this, people do not survive.
This is actually not true. There are many regions of the world where water is shipped over to different villages and cities because they simply do not have a lake next to them. We see that a lot of the sources that Team Opposition is proposing is actually not taking into account the fact that there aren't all of these resources in every part of the world. If this is not true, then we cannot expand alternative energy to every part of the world unless we create a plurality in the market where we are trying to develop every single type of alternative energy to figure out which one works best in which part of the world, in which case we would not create efficiency in any of those types of alternative energy. So moving on, so in response to our second argument about how this is crucial to innovation, they argue that it is fostering dependence. But we argue a few things to this. First of all, that they themselves have made a contradiction by arguing that we should be investing in alternative energy to make it better. In fact, we argue if they argue this, then why are they arguing that investing in nuclear energy will not make nuclear energy better? We are also argue that the technology that they are supporting is not sustainable right now, and we have been trying to make it sustainable for decades, but we've only seen the most efficiency come out of nuclear energy. We argue furthermore that they do not understand how the energy market works and that they are closing off an entire section of the market, which under team proposition you wouldn't be doing. You would just be expanding the market. You would be allowing for innovation instead of closing off a part of the market. But moving on to their own arguments, the argument about the harms of nuclear energies. Now to this, we say that in fact these accidents that happen in the world are not only inevitable, but they actually make the technology better. Because accidents promote regulation. And we argue that in every type of energy, there will be accidents. But in fact, these types of energy are the safest after we have accidents because we find out the problems that we see in these different forms of energy and we fix them. And that we shouldn't write off forms of energy just because we see accidents. If that were true, then after the Exxon Valdez crisis, after the Deepwater Horizon rig, we see that we would just stop all of our oil industry. We would start over with something new. This is an inefficient way of looking at development, and we argue that it would promote anti-progress and no development in society. And their second argument was about the better alternatives, but we have really already talked about why alternative energy does not work everywhere in the world. It is inefficient, and furthermore, that in the developing world, we see the unique problem with having alternative energy. But moving on to our case in the debate. First of all, about the benefits of nuclear technology. We have told you over and over again that nuclear energy is the only sustainable source that we see today in the world. It is not finite like oil. It is not dependent on the environment the way renewables are. And we've already developed it to the extent that we can actually use it in the future. Something the team opposition cannot tell you is happening with alternative energies. Yes?
This is completely false. Nuclear energy actually depends on things. You need developed scientific technology.
Exactly.
You need scientists. You need people that don't exist in certain countries.
This development only happens when we don't close off the ability to promote progress and innovation. We argue that under side proposition at the end of the day, you are allowing still for some development of alternative energy, but we are arguing that there is a place for nuclear energy in the future. And under team opposition, all you are doing is closing off a part of the market. But furthermore, we have shown you that we've already developed nuclear energy, actually made it sustainable and usable in countries in ways that alternative energy never can. In France, we see a large amount of energy being created by nuclear energy, while things like wind have only been successful in minuscule amounts in places like Germany, where it's not even able to provide enough energy for their entire nation. It's not even able to provide it for really a fraction of the nation. We have shown you how nuclear energy is more efficient. We argue that it is more efficient than any other source we have right now. You have more bang for your buck because of its efficiency, and that this makes it able to transfer to the developing world. We are taking into account the places where there are energy crises, not the developed world in which they may be able to afford decades of futile attempts at creating alternative energy, but we are talking about places where the crisis is actually happening. Now, we argue that there is no other way to fuel an entire nation with technology that is created with alternative energy. So we have shown you the impacts of this argument about how in the developing world, millions of people are being denied the basic necessities of life. And those basic necessities include energy. And we have shown you why only nuclear energy can actually solve that problem. And we argue that the proposition is essentially arguing for the status quo. And we've been trying to develop alternatives for years with no results. Moving on to our second argument, that this is crucial for innovation. We have shown you up and down the bench so far that by voting for opposition, you are essentially hurting the entire energy market, an argument which they haven't entirely understood or just simply ignored. We argue that when you look through history about the way development energy works, that we see that by creating coal, something which may not be considered the most safe or the most beneficial to the environment, you created steam energy. That from oil energy, you created biofuels. And we see that by closing off an entire section of the market, you never allow for that necessary development of creating safer and better forms of energy. And as we have told you many times before, France has been incredibly successful in creating technology which takes nuclear waste and makes it into more energy. This in fact would cut the amount of radiation and create more efficient forms of innovation. So we argue that nuclear energy is not only efficient today, but is a stepping stone to creating innovation in the industry and creating better forms of energy in the future. And that we are bettering our capabilities not only in the energy field, but in other fields of science as well. Now we argue that our side is pro-progress, pro-development, and by voting for the proposition, you would be allowed to innovate, even in conjunction with other types of alternatives. But by voting for the opposition, all you are doing is closing a market. You are not fostering dependence necessarily by voting for team proposition. You are just opening science to allow to do what science is supposed to do: innovate, create, and change the future. Thank you.
Second opposition.
Japan used to convince their public about the safety of nuclear energy using cartoons and animations on tours of nuclear reactors. And as we all know, the Japanese public is obsessed with cute things, in their language, kawaii. However, after the 2011 Fukushima incident that resulted from the Great East Japan earthquake of 2011, the Japanese public is no longer convinced. And so today's side opposition today stands with the Japanese public. And it stands with all these other societies and cultures around the world that realize the dangers of nuclear energy, that realize that a sustainable future does not include an energy form that harms the people. And so side opposition today proudly opposes the motion. This House believes that there is no future without nuclear energy. So before I extend the positive matter of side opposition's case, I would like to first address side proposition's points, starting with their first point, that there are benefits to nuclear energy. Now, side opposition today concedes that there are benefits to nuclear energy, but side proposition conveniently forgets all the harms of nuclear energy when extorting the benefits of nuclear energy. And so side opposition today wants to make this debate fair by telling you every single negative harm of nuclear energy. And so since many have already been covered by side opposition's first speaker, I would just like to point out that the harms truly outweigh the benefits. Now, they claim that nuclear energy is reliable. Well, so is what the European Union deems a renewable energy source would. So is the sun, because the world relies on the sun, and without the sun, we wouldn't be here. So obviously, it's reliable in sustaining our lives, our food supply, and everything that goes along with it. And so they claim it's sustainable. But we have brought up many additional alternatives in which it is more sustainable, in which there aren't nuclear wastes that proliferate for tens of thousands of years that will impact future generations to come. And there are energy sources that don't require such great compromises, that will compromise not only our next generations, but our future as humanity. Would you not agree?
The other alternative energy sources, such as wood they're bringing up, have equally detrimental effects on the environment, as we see through wood and carbon gas emissions.
Thank you. But we realize that we bring up a plethora of alternatives. And when side proposition adamantly states that nuclear energy is the only way, and that without nuclear energy we have no future, which is such a strong and preposterous claim by the proposition, we as the opposition provide you an array of options to prove that without nuclear energy, there certainly is a future for humanity on Earth. Now, to address their second point, that it is crucial for development, now side proposition is being extremely ironic, because side proposition cannot change the fundamental nature of atoms. Side proposition cannot rewrite the rules of chemistry, unless I've been mistaken, but I believe that they can't change the radioactive nature of nuclear energy. Now, you can put a lipstick on a pig, but it's still a pig. You see, we've been developing oil for hundreds of years. We've now gone into fracking, but fracking causes earthquakes. It causes all kinds of negative chemicals being leaked into our groundwater, and this is the result of hundreds of years of development. And the proposition claims that this is good. Okay, we need to focus on energy in which there are no detriments, and that development will only lead to greater sustainable and renewable energy without detriments. And proposition is sticking for an energy that will always create huge detriments no matter how they develop it. So now, with the opposition case addressed, I would like to move on to extend the opposition's case. Now, first of all, I would like to point out that there are nuclear harms. And those side propositions state that France is working to reduce nuclear waste. The fact of the matter is that when their nuclear waste is so huge, reduction does not reduce not only the risk of environmental leaking, but also the damage that it can cause and the magnitude of the impact on not only the peoples of France, but also the peoples of Europe and the world. I would like to point out that the environmental damages of nuclear disasters have unfortunately been made clear by the repeated disasters found in history books, and that side proposition clearly does not realize the harms when they only extort the benefits. They don't realize that there are actually truly people dying from this, that there are actually people being born as a result of something they did not do, and that's only the result of an energy form that cannot be used if we want a sustainable and better future. I would like to also bring up the example of Green Island, where the government has used this Aboriginal home to store nuclear energy. And this is just one way in which nuclear energy is also used to oppress natives and Aboriginals in a territory where they are now marginalized. And so you see that by pushing dangers onto people that are already marginalized and minorities, we are only creating a world that is even more devastating to all peoples in the world. And I would like to move on to our second point that side opposition has already repeatedly gone over, and the fact that there are other alternatives. Now, the fact of the matter is that the sun supplies the entire world, and where there is no sun, there ought to be wind, and where there's no wind, there ought to be water, and where there is no water, there ought to be something else that is not as dangerous and as terrible as nuclear energy. And so you see that development into these true renewable energy resources will actually create something that our world can use sustainably. Now, we see that nuclear energy has been developed for more than half a century, starting from 1945 in the United States with their focus on nuclear weapons, and after that it was transformed into civilian usage. But we see after half a century of development, we have not been able to get rid of any of the negative impacts that still pose such a threat to humanity around the world. And yet we see that when we start with something that has no inherent detriment, that has no inherent law of chemistry that governs the fact that it will be harmful, we see that development. And instead of dependence on nuclear energy, if we move these funds to development into actual energy sources that humanity is okay with, we see that development will be exponential. And as we've already seen, solar prices have dropped tremendously as a result of competition and the global market. And I'm sure that reducing arsenic is much more easily done than fundamentally rewriting chemistry books around the world. Now, I would like to move on to the third argument, that a brighter future is created without nuclear energy. Now, side opposition's burden today is to show that without nuclear energy, there is a future. But side opposition today believes that we are going above and beyond our burden by showing that without nuclear energy, humanity is gaining a brighter, better future. And so this argument first explores the nuclear dangers, as have already been stated by side opposition, that all of these environmental damages, that all these damages to humanity cannot go on, and that there has to be better ways, as side proposition has provided. Now, secondly, nuclear energy is also a facade for regimes to use to gain nuclear weapons, and that is the ultimate destructive force in our world today. That North Korea and Iran have both used the examples of nuclear energy to pursue illicit nuclear weapons, and this is a threat that humanity cannot tolerate for a sustainable future. Now, also, we see that Japan, after their earthquake, turned off all nuclear reactors, and yet since After that, their economy has grown at the fastest pace in 20 years. We see 4% in GDP growth, means that nuclear reactors, without them, Japan can actually grow faster than with them. So we see that nuclear energy is also not necessary for a better, brighter future. So when we see that nuclear energy has inherent damages that side proposition can never wipe out only with their words, when we see that there are clear alternatives that in fact mean a better world for humanity, and when we see that nuclear energy is being exploited by the world to bad purposes, side opposition is proud to oppose.
And I call upon the third Gov speaker.
Ladies and gentlemen, this discussion is just not about the availability of technologies in the now. It is about sustainable development for the future. And at the end of the day, there's only one team that effectively stands by this, side proposition. In my speech today, I will be examining this debate in two major ways. First, I'll be comparing nuclear energy versus other forms of alternative energies, and secondly, be addressing this idea of safety and show why, at the end of the day, side proposition has won on both claims. So basically, we can summarize side opposition's case into one major point. First, they argue that nuclear energy has problems, and secondly, we should just ignore nuclear energy as a viable source and continue on to other sources of development. But we think that they ultimately deny themselves this stance. Why? They argue that these technologies that they're advocating for, solar energy, wind energy, hydroelectric energy, they have problems in the now. That's why they haven't been accepted widely by the international community. That's why really only countries like Germany have been able to adopt wind energy as even effective for being a part of their energy portfolio. Yet they deny themselves the stance that they are taking, because they agree that there are problems with these alternative energies right now, yet they say that by putting money into development, that they can solve these problems. We think that, number one, the same argument applies to nuclear energy, but number two, that nuclear energy represents an even more effective and sustainable approach to energy than do any form of alternative energy that they have brought up in their stance today. Yes.
I would like to point out that most countries in this world have not adopted nuclear energy precisely because of the dangers, and yet have adopted alternative forms of energy.
Sir, we think that the dangers that they talk about nuclear waste, yet we've given you one example that shows countries diverting resources and developing ways to handle this nuclear waste. But we think that by taking nuclear energy out of the portfolio, which countries can consider as options when they are creating the energy sources for which they maintain their country's ability to function, we think that by taking nuclear energy out of this, we lose the opportunity to develop ways to dispose of nuclear waste. We lose the opportunities to combat these problems. We see that by taking the problem out, we see that by viewing nuclear energy as the problem, they're taking the wrong stance. We see that there are problems in nuclear energy, but by taking it out of our energy portfolio and not combating the issues with the nuclear energy, then we're totally missing the point of this debate. So, we think that they want immediate results. They say that somehow alternative energies and the things that they're proposing somehow don't have any negative effects. But we see that we've talked about how ultimately solar panels emit arsenic, and that's the major problem in which development, especially in our home country of the United States. There, we've also seen the fact that the company Solindra hasn't really been an overwhelming success in terms of solar energy. We don't think that's sustainable right now, and that's exactly why nuclear energy has been adopted by many countries in the international community. So we think that this brings us to one major question. Is nuclear energy so bad that it cannot be improved? We think that that's an overwhelmingly no. We think that nuclear energy, by diverting resources into nuclear energy, we can combat the problems that we see within today and make it even better. But what's more is that we think that by diverting resources to nuclear energy, we can develop further technologies, because we see a fundamental misunderstanding by the opposition of the energy market and of the technological innovation market in general. We see that in technology, in science, in any field related to these, we see that products are built upon each other. Technology and innovation is built upon past innovation. So by taking out nuclear energy, by totally excluding it from the market, we see that we lose the opportunity to develop any new energies, any new opportunities, any new developments that could come from putting resources into nuclear energy. That's only something side proposition can provide to you. So we think that they say that hydroelectric energy, solar energy, these forms of energy really don't have any detriments. We've proven to you, number one, that that's really not true, and number two, that nuclear energy is actually more favorable, and by combating problems with it, we can actually have a better future in terms of renewable energy. So we think that that argument about investment and development of alternative energies ultimately falls on our side of the house because the same argument applies even better to nuclear forms of energy. So we think that at the end of the day, nuclear energy represents a sustainable and usable form of energy in the now. Why? We've talked to you about the benefits of return on investment, how nuclear energy is ultimately more profitable than other forms of alternative energy in the now. Other forms of energy that they've been talking about aren't as sustainable as nuclear energy is, and that's already why there's bigger global acceptance. Really, the only instance that they can provide in which their forms of energy have been implemented is the country of Germany. But we say that if they're really arguing for development of countries, then Germany ultimately has one of the largest percentage of GDPs, and the fact that wind energy isn't sustainable, combined with the fact that Germany's GDP shows that it's really not implementable at this time. But we see that if we focus solely on alternative energy that depends on climate, that depends on different country situations, we see that you're taking attention away and ultimately creating an investment market that's really not plural and not sustainable for most of the world. So now let's move on to this idea of safety. We see that they talk a lot about how nuclear energy is not safe, how it causes waste and nuclear radiation. But we think that ultimately that the developments that come from the disasters that they have cited, 3 Mile Island, Fukushima Daiichi, the developments that come about because of these accidents ultimately serve to better improve the future. Why? These accidents point out major flaws in technology that are ultimately improved. They brought us to you the example of Japan, but we see that Japan's country has actually created commissions to solve the problems that were designed with the reactor. We see that it's actually unique because the Fukushima Daiichi reactor was caused by a natural disaster. It was caused by the 2010 earthquake and the tsunami, wherein other forms of energy, the oil rigs and things like that, were actually caused by safety regulations with that form of energy. But yet we see that in the long run, developments that come from these accidents will ultimately only make these forms of energy safer. But what's more is that we think that they're fundamentally misunderstanding the technological industry in the fact that by taking out nuclear energy from the world's portfolio, we're ultimately hindering investment and development within the energy market. That's only something that we can provide to you today. So we see that ultimately they talked a little bit in their second speech about militarization, how nuclear energy and these countries will ultimately lead to development of nuclear weapons. But we see that first, that hasn't been the case. We see that the country of Iran has ultimately had nuclear power and nuclear energy reactors for a long period of time. Yet, the international community and watchdog organizations, the International Atomic Energy Association, the United Nations Security Council, they've been effective at making sure that Iran doesn't adopt nuclear weapons, so we don't see any problems that we're talking about in the current situation. But at the end of the day, we view nuclear power as crucial to innovation. So why is the energy market the way it is today? Why is technological development the way it is today? It's because of the fact that we see technology built on top of technology. Something that only one side in this debate gives to you, and that's a proposition. We see that ultimately by taking nuclear energy out of the world's portfolio, we lose any sort of opportunity to develop on top of these developments. We lose any sort of opportunity to benefit from combating the problems that we see in the nuclear energy today. But moreover, we argue that nuclear energy is more effective than any sort of alternative energy that they have provided thus far. So we see that the international community stands to benefit from the developments of using nuclear energy, and we see that by excluding nuclear energy from development, we miss out on newer, better technologies. So at the end of the day, side opposition is turning a blind eye to progress, to innovation, and we see that side proposition serves nuclear energy as a stepping stone for newer and better technologies. So there's only one team in this debate that can advocate for advancement of energy that allows for significant innovation within the international community, and that is side proposition. Thank you.
I call upon the third op speaker to close the opposition case.
Thousands of acres of land devastated, destroyed, massive debt. People in the surrounding areas having cancer, extreme pain, tumors. This was the reality of Chernobyl. This was the reality of 3 Mile Island. This was the reality of Japan. This is the reality of the world the proposition wants to create. And that is why you must oppose this motion. Now, today, let us examine 3 areas of clash in this debate. First, nuclear power versus alternatives. Second, international safety. And lastly, we will look at this debate holistically. And in the third area of clash, we'll examine the 2 worlds created by the proposition and by the opposition. All right, first, on nuclear power versus alternatives. And I'm going to quote Team Proposition. They said, nuclear radiation is not a problem. First of all, you cannot change the essential nature of nuclear power, of nuclear energy. It is, in a sense, and gets its power from being a radioactive, dangerous material. And so you cannot gamble millions of lives on this kind of on this assumption that somehow all of these radioactive problems will go away. They say that we will ultimately develop new technology through development. But look at Chernobyl. Look at 3 Mile Island. In the past, now look at Japan. In the now. Did Japan learn from the mistakes of the past? No, they did not. And so we see that development has not worked. All their arguments are pure rhetoric, and the track record shows that countries such as Japan have not learned from the past. On the issue of sustainability, is it really sustainable to have leakage for centuries? In Finland, the news and the government have clearly stated that they're going to store away nuclear waste for 10,000 years because of the immense problems due to leakage. And so sustainability is not an argument for the proposition, and is in fact turned against them. They say that the return is greater for nuclear energy. However, the loss of life far outweighs any kind of benefit they can get from a utopic, safe nuclear power. They said that the radiation will be dealt with, and they gave only the example of France, which is one country, and that's an isolated example. But however, in France, they have scientific progress, but only 1% of nuclear waste can be reharvested. And so in France, they're not making any real scientific leaps, and the harms far outweigh the benefits because of the mass death that can ensue. They say that there are no countries with water, wind, or oil. However, don't all countries have some sort of environment? Don't they have sun, wind, or water? Even hydrogen has no need for sea access. Look at the other side of the coin. Nuclear power is very expensive. They say that we're going to provide nuclear power for the whole world and for developing nations. How are these developing nations going to afford to safely have nuclear power? Yes, they may have some kind of nuclear power, but it will be very dangerous. It could be poorly done because they simply do not have the funds. And so either these developing nations will have nuclear power and it will be very dangerous, or they will not develop it and they won't have the resources to. And so that argument is a wash. Also, they say other alternatives have problems, like solar power has arsenic, but Team Opposition is asking you to weigh arsenic poisoning, which they have not shown to affect the people. They just said there's studies about arsenic and solar panels. But against the massive debt that the proposition is advocating for, that has been vindicated by history, yes.
Sir, we think that by ignoring the problem, ignoring nuclear energy, and by taking out, they're losing the opportunity to
Okay, thank you. I'll get to that. Improved technology, we spent centuries, we spent decades on nuclear power. You would think that we would have some kind of development by now, that Japan would have a way to stop these nuclear reactions from being destroyed. And so ultimately, we've given nuclear power its chance, and it has failed us. It has killed thousands of people. All right, on the issue of money, first of all, money is insignificant in the face of people dying, and the fact that we have to clean up afterwards. No, thank you. In Japan, the GDP actually rose after they stopped nuclear energy. So the money argument is clearly in favor of the opposition because it is insignificant and we are still winning on economics.
Sir.
No, thank you. On the issue of innovation, first of all, the opposition is clearly saying in this debate that, first of all, this dependence argument goes both ways. By expanding the nuclear market, destroy any alternative fuel market and any alternative energy. And so, and then the proposition claims the same thing on the other side. And so this is a wash on this issue because innovation can go both ways. In fact, you'll destroy the industry both ways. And so innovation ultimately, first of all, is not unique to the proposition, and ultimately the opposition, because the nuclear industry is such a huge industry, it'll ultimately crowd out any alternative fuels. Okay, on the issue of alternatives having problems, everything has problems, but the nuclear industry has a track record of mass destruction, while the solar panel industry has arsenic. Have they linked that to humans? Have they linked that to massive death? No, they have not, but we clearly show we cannot accept the harms of nuclear power. And so, the last offensive argument is that we are too dependent on the environment. Isn't that a good thing? The sun won't run out until it's too late for humans. Wind won't leak deadly poisons into the ground. And so it's good that we're dependent on the environment, Because the environment is everywhere. There's no, they're assuming that there's going to be a lack of sun or wind in all places in the world. Yes.
They're misunderstanding our argument. We're arguing that these forms of energy is not implementable in all countries, while nuclear energy is.
Okay, let's look. Is nuclear energy implementable in developing nations who can't afford to feed their own citizens or clothe their own citizens or give these citizens jobs?
Sure.
No, it is not. And so ultimately, solar energy is becoming increasingly competitive, increasingly cheaper. And so in answer to that statement, solar panels, solar energy, alternative energy such as wind and hydrogen power are becoming increasingly less expensive and more competitive. Lastly, they say that oil needs to give way to biofuels, etc., etc. We need to give way to nuclear power. However, we think that nuclear power must give way to alternative fuels such as wind, hydrogen power, solar power. And so ultimately, they are stopping progress. Side proposition is stopping progress, while the opposition gives you way out of this destructive cycle of nuclear devastation. So the magnitude is immense because thousands of acres are destroyed, millions of people can die, and radiation poisoning causes cancer for generations to come. And even if there isn't this big explosion that we've seen in the past, there is leakage. There's massive death from leakage and from radiation that when these rods are discarded. And so the probability is also high because even though we've had so many years to develop, Japan had a natural disaster hit its nuclear facilities and ultimately caused more death. And so we have not learned from the mistakes of the past in terms of nuclear power, and we need to give alternative fuels a chance. So the risk is extremely high, and we far outweigh on the nuclear power versus alternatives. Now, in international safety, for North Korea and Iran, nuclear power is a facade for nuclear weapons. They say that we have councils, but can they take radiation out of nuclear energy, out of nuclear power? No, they cannot. Also, North Korea is extremely volatile. There's no telling what this madman will do in power. Also, they say that there are many accidents, but there's also problems in other industries. How much are you willing to gamble? There was Chernobyl, there was 3 Mile Island. It didn't help Japan. The actions of the future ultimately did not increase development. Finally, on the issue of who creates a better world. On the opposition, we give you cheaper, cleaner alternatives, which are ensured because of competition. We give you less international tension because we are stopping nuclear weapons from being in the hands of oppressive dictatorships. We are not being dependent on nuclear power, which crowds out markets, and ultimately we are saving people's lives. We are saving the environment. The proposition needed to prove that nuclear energy is the only way to survive. However, they've shown how we are not ultimately solving the problems of nuclear radiation. They have not taken the radiation out of nuclear power, and ultimately you have to look to the opposition, and this motion must fall. Thank you.
And I'll call upon the op reply speaker.
This House believes that there is no future without nuclear energy. Now let's look at the proposition who was supposed to propose this motion, and let's examine their entire case. Do they believe that without nuclear energy, there is no future? No, they don't. They believe that they will remove one item from the portfolio. They believe that this energy is beneficial, but they never, in 3 speeches, ever stated that without nuclear energy, we won't have a future. They merely state that this may not be a wise thing to do, that it may be better to keep it, but they never prove their burden, that without nuclear energy, there is no future. And so on this point alone, the proposition has already lost the debate, and there is no debate when the proposition fails to uphold their burden. But then, side opposition is not so heartless. So, side opposition went above and beyond their burden, and debated whether nuclear energy was possible in a better and brighter future. And this is only possible when we weigh the benefits and harms of nuclear energy to determine whether the future will be brighter and better with or without nuclear energy. So now we weigh. Side proposition has stated that nuclear energy is sustainable, That is non-unique. The sun is also sustainable, and I'm sure it'll be sustainable for far more time than nuclear energy, because when the sun runs out, we'll all be ashes, or not even ashes, we'll return into molecules again. They say that nuclear energy is reliable. Well, so is what the EU considers renewable energy, the burning of wood. So is the sun in being reliable, and so is the tide in also being reliable. Again, all of the benefits side proposition brings up are non-unique to nuclear energy alone. And finally, side proposition says that nuclear energy is not finite. Well, neither is the sun, the wind, or the water. And in fact, when these are finite, that means death for us. So then, in that case, we wouldn't have this debate. So basically, all the benefits of nuclear energy brought forth by the proposition, including that this could be developed into a better thing, even though side opposition has shown you putting lipstick on a pig doesn't make a pig, a beauty queen, it's still a pig. Side proposition's entire case, all of their benefits are non-unique. And the fact of the matter is that they can't change the basic laws of chemistry, and so then that brings me into the harms. Now, all of the harms of nuclear energy are unique. No other energy leaks poison into the environment. No other energy can implode and cause cancer into millions of people at once. No other energy can cause so much damage in so little time. And no other energy also has such magnitude of just one single mistake. And so when you see that nuclear energy has benefits that can be easily reaped from other alternative fuels that side opposition has provided you a plethora of, you see that nuclear energy has no unique benefits, but a ton of unique harms. You also see that nuclear energy can be used by countries such as India, Pakistan, and North Korea to develop nuclear weapons, and that is something the world considers to be one of the greatest threats to all of humanity. And yet side proposition still supports this deadly thing. And then we bring up the example of Green Island, where the government has used nuclear waste to oppress Aborigines and marginalized populations, and yet side proposition never responded to this. And in developing countries, they're simply unable to afford, and even if they are, they will run shoddy nuclear plants that will only endanger the safety of the world. So when you see that nuclear benefits are clearly outweighed by unique nuclear harms provided to you by side opposition, and then you go back to the resolution and consider the fact that side proposition never upheld their burden, it is absolutely clear that side opposition has won today's debate, and therefore side opposition is extremely proud to propose.
And I'll call upon the proper reply.
Team opposition has only given you problems. Team proposition has given you the solutions. We stand by the line that advancements of nuclear energy will lead to innovation. Now, before I talk about what will happen in the proposition to opposition world, let's first address the burden. They have argued that we must prove that there will be no future without nuclear energy, but in fact, I cannot prove to you that the world will spontaneously combust if you vote for the opposition. Our burden is to prove that there is no place in the future for nuclear energy. And we have proven to you that not only is there a place, but it is inevitable and will have benefits. Now, we say that also on team opposition, team opposition, that no one will practically have energy if you vote for their side, and in fact, that will practically be the world's ending. So let's look at the precedent that team opposition creates if you vote for them. Now, what will happen in the opposition world, essentially their only argument for not having nuclear energy is that it has accidents and that has created environmental problems. So using their own logic, we would stop nuclear energy today if there's no place for it in the future. We would stop all development that we have. In fact, we would stop utilizing oil because they have argued that fracking has created problems. We would stop using alternatives in the future when we see a slight problem that we do not want to solve because we just want to ignore and start something new and just start over. We argue that do we stop development every time we see a problem? And we say no. That leads to no progress, that leads to no innovation, and that has not been addressed by side opposition. They have even conceded that, we've both conceded that development makes technology better. And we have shown you why uniquely having nuclear energy is the way to go. Because we argue that we should use the most sustainable, the most efficient source of energy, and the one that can actually be used all over the world to solve crises. And the team opposition has not shown you that in this debate. We say that, that in fact, the other possibility in world opposition is that we would remain dependent on oil because we are stopping our ability to innovate in any other aspect other than alternatives, which we assume will not work because they have not given a single example of a nation that has been able to utilize it correctly. We say that while all they can argue is about sob stories of times when nuclear energy has had mistakes and problems, we say that they did not look at what developed after them. They've only given 3 examples of times when nuclear energy has failed and created radiation. 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl are included in that. And we argue that the mistakes that happened in those times never happened again. That those mistakes were solved. Maybe a different mistake led to another breakdown, but the mistakes that we see, we created solutions to. And those solutions are becoming less and less frequent, and we have not seen problems in in the recent past. We say that we have seen that development has actually created solutions. But looking into the proposition world, we have shown you that how we are developing the energy market and how team opposition has fundamentally misunderstood the energy market. We argue that putting money into a market does not create a dependency. That is just showing their lack of understanding of the market. That only one side, and that is team opposition, is creating dependency, and that is when you close a market and make whatever market has current control keep continuing. And that is the oil market, ladies and gentlemen. That is the market that will continue, not alternative energy. We have shown you that nuclear energy has been already implemented, and because of this, it is feasible, that it can happen in other places, if we continue to innovate. And we argue that this is how you solve the problems of the world, by continuing this innovation. In terms of weaponization, we have proved to you that in terms of even places like North Korea, who demand nuclear technology, even their closest allies, like China, turn their back against them when they insist on developing nuclear technology. And in other places than energy. And we argue that they're discounting the power of the international community to make sure that this technology is being used safely. Furthermore, we argue that because team opposition is being stuck in the past, when the topic itself calls for a discussion of the future, we argue that team proposition is the way to go. We are not being idealistic, we're being realistic, and we've shown you the feasible benefits of nuclear energy. Thank you.